opposed and spoke against the Stamp Act. And he said there was a necessity for the colonies to stay in union, to secure their liberties. He was famous in part for these election sermons that he gave, espousing American rights, the cause of liberty, and the right to duty to resist tyranny. Probably one of his greatest known sermons was a discourse concerning unlimited submission. Now, during that discourse, actually it was given on the 100th year anniversary of the beheading of Charles I. Remember him? Well, at the time in 1750, Charles I, in the minds of some people, was having a rebirth of respectability. And Mayhew would have none of that. He spoke in this sermon for about 40 pages, covering the history of Charles I. And then he reached his major point, was the essential rightness, not only the essential rightness of the execution of the king, well, because he too greatly infringed, his essential point was the rightness of executing the English king when he too greatly infringed upon British liberties. The vigor of Mayhew's sermon established his reputation. It was published not only in Boston, but also in London in 1752 and again in 1767. And in Boston, a man named John Adams, who was remembered long afterwards Mayhew's sermon, and he said that it was read by everybody. This is John Adams talking. Some would say later that this sermon was the first volley of the American Revolution, setting forth the intellectual and scriptural justification for rebellion against the crown. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great privilege, invoking special circumstance, and I want you to give a warm welcome, and maybe a few amens might be in order as well, because I want to introduce you to Jonathan Mayhew.
Thus, upon a careful review of the Apostles' reasoning in this passage, Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, it appears that his arguments to enforce submission are of such a nature as to conclude only in a favor of submission to such rulers as he himself subscribes. That is, such rulers of good society, which is the only end of their institution. Common tyrants and public oppressors are not entitled to obedience from their subjects by virtue of anything here laid down by the inspired apostle. I now add further that the apostle's argument is so far from proving it to the duty of people to obey and submit to such rulers as act in contradiction to the public good, and so the designs of their offices, that it proves the direct contrary. For please to observe that if the end of all civil government be the good of society, it is this, if this be the thing that is aimed at constituting civil rulers, and if the motive and argument for submission to government be taken from the apparent usefulness of civil authority, it follows that when no such good end can be answered by submission, there remains no agreement or motive to enforce it. And if instead of this good end being besought by submission, a contrary end is brought about, and the ruin and misery of society affected by it, here is plain and positive reason against submission in all such cases, should they ever happen. And therefore, in such cases, a regard to the public welfare ought to make us withhold from our rulers that obedience and subjection which it would otherwise be our duty to render to them. If it be our duty, for example, to obey our king, merely for this reason, that he rules for the public welfare, which is the only argument the apostle makes use of, it follows by a parity of reason that when he turns tyrant and makes his subjects his prey to devour and to destroy, instead of his charge to defend and cherish, we are bound to throw off our allegiance to him and to resist, and that according to the tenor of the apostle's argument in this passage. Not to discountenance our allegiance in this case would be to join with the sovereign in promoting the slavery and misery of society, the welfare of which we ourselves, as well as our sovereigns, are indispensably obliged to secure and promote as far as in us lies. It is true, the apostle puts the case of such a tyrannical prince, but by his grounding his argument for submission wholly upon the good of civil society, it is plain he implicitly authorizes and even requires us to make resistance whenever this shall be necessary to the public safety and happiness. Let me make of easy and familiar similitude to illustrate the point in hand. Suppose God requires of a family of children to obey their father and not to resist him, and enforces his command with this argument, that the superintendence and care and authority of a just and kind parent will contribute to the happiness of the whole family, so that they ought to obey him for their own sakes more than for his. Suppose this parent at length runs distracted and attempts in his mad fit to cut all his children's throats. Now in this case, is not the reason before assigned why these children should obey their parent while he continued of sound mind, namely their common good, a reason equally conclusive for disobeying and resisting him, since he has become delirious and attempts their ruin? It makes no alteration in the argument whether this parent, properly speaking, loses his reason or does while he retains his understanding, that which is fatal in its consequences as anything he could do were he really deprived of it. This similitude needs no formal application. But it ought to be remembered that if the duty of the universal obedience and non-resistance to our king or prince can be argued from this passage, the same unlimited submission under a republican or other form of government, and to even all subordinate powers in any particular case, can be proved by it as well, which is more than those who allege it for mentioned purpose would be willing should be inferred from it. So that this passage does not answer their purpose, but really overthrows and confutes it. This matter deserves to be more particularly considered. The advocates for unlimited submission and passive obedience do, if I mistake not, always speak with reference to kingly or monarchical government as distinguished from all other forms, and with reference to submitting to the will of the king, in distinction from all subordinate officers, acting beyond their commission and the authority which they have received from the crown. It is not pretended that any person besides kings have a divine right to do what they please, so that no one may resist them without incurring the guilt of factiousness and rebellion. If any other supreme power oppress the people, it is generally allowed that the people may get redress by resistance if other methods prove ineffectual. And if any officers in a kingly government go beyond the limits of that power which they have derived from the crown, the supposed original source of all power and authority in that state, and attempt illegally to take away the properties and lives of their fellow subjects, they may be forcibly resisted, at least till application can be made to the crown. But as to the sovereign himself, he may not be resisted in any case, nor any of his officers, while they confine themselves within the bounds which he has prescribed to them. This is, I think, a true sketch of the principles of those who defend the doctrine of passive obedience and non-resistance. Now, there is nothing in Scripture which supports this scheme of political principles. As to the passage under consideration, the apostle here speaks of civil rulers in general, of all persons in common, vested with authority for the good of society without any particular reference to one form of government more than to another, or to the supreme power in any particular state more than to subordinate powers. The apostle does not concern himself with the different forms of government. This, he supposed, is left entirely to the human prudence and discretion. Now, the consequence of this is that unlimited and passive obedience is no more enjoined in this passage under monarchical government or to the supreme power in any state than under all other species of government which answer to the end of government, or to all subordinate degrees of civil authority from the highest to the lowest. Those, therefore, who would from this passage infer the guilt of resisting kings, in all cases whatever, though acting ever so contrary to the design of their office, must, if they will be consistent, go much further and infer from it guilt of resistance under all other forms of government and of resisting any petty officers in the state, though acting beyond his commission in the most arbitrary, illegal manner possible. The argument holds equally in both cases. All civil rulers, as such, are the ordinance and ministers of God, and they are all, by the nature of their office and in their respective spheres and stations, beholden to consult the public welfare. With the same reason, therefore, that any deny unlimited and passive obedience to be here enjoined under a republic or aristocracy or any other established form of government, or to subordinate powers acting in an illegal and oppressive manner, which is the same reason. Others may deny that such obedience is enjoined to a king or a monarch, or to any civil power whatever. For the apostle says nothing that is peculiar to kings. What he says extends equally to all other persons whatever, vested with any civil office. They are all, in exactly the same sense, the ordinance of God and the ministers of God. And obedience is equally enjoined to be paid to them all. For as the apostle expresses it, there is no power but of God, and we are required to render to all their dues, and not more than their dues. And what these dues are, and to whom they are to be rendered, the apostle saith not, but leaves to the reason and consciences of men to determine. Thus it appears that the common argument grounded upon this passage in favor of universal and passive obedience really overthrows itself by proving too much. If it proves anything at all, namely that no civil officer is in any case whatever to be resisted through, though acting in express contradiction to the design of his office, which no man in his senses ever did or can assert, if we calmly consider the nature of the thing itself, nothing can well be imagined more directly contrary to common sense than to suppose that millions of people should be subjected to the arbitrary, precarious pleasure of one single man, who has naturally no superiority over them in point of authority, so that they, their estates, and everything that is valuable in life, and even their lives also, shall be absolutely at his disposal if he happens to be wanton and capricious, though demand them. What unprejudiced man can think that God made all to be thus subservient to the lawless pleasure and frenzy of one, so that it shall always be a sin to resist him? Nothing but the most plain and express revelation from heaven could make a sober, impartial man believe such a monstrous, unaccountable doctrine. And indeed, the thing itself appears so shocking, so out of all proportion, that it may be questioned whether all the miracles that ever were wrought could make it credible that this doctrine really came from God. At present, there is not the least syllable in Scripture which gives any countenance to it.
Amen.
Thank you, Pastor Mayhew. Delirious, shocking, out of all proportions. You heard those words, right? That's what Jonathan Mayhew was calling non-resistance to abusive, despotic, tyrannical power. That's where the authors of the Constitution of the state of Maryland came up with that idea. I'm not saying they came up, they got it specifically from Jonathan Mayhew, but it was this kind of understanding, this biblical understanding, this biblical worldview